does this serve the interests of the international community as a whole? U.S. objectives for Iraq. We have expended a lot of effort and energy to try to hold together a unitary or a territorially intact Iraqi state, the argument being that we don't want a breakaway situation in the north. Questions of precedents, and precedents here not being what we've often seen discussed in the literature, the idea that if you have one case occur, that somehow creates this automatic rule that you now have to be consistent in your policy. States are never consistent in how they apply policies or anything of that sort. But the question is the wedge issue. We're seeing politicians in Taiwan. What are they saying about UDI for Kosovo? What does this do for our potential to claim recognition that we don't necessarily need the recognition of all the major states of the Security Council or even of the UN? We just simply can see if we can get more and more states to agree. Interestingly enough, a piece that I wrote on this kind of unexpected discussion in China and Taiwan a few days ago, I've now understood has been, it's no longer, you cannot access it on the internet in Beijing. It's been blocked because apparently it's become a controversial subject of discussion. Why I'm sort of throwing a number of these things out is not to say let's try to suggest that we're going to have, event happens here, will lead to something here, will lead to something here, but we do need to see this as something more than just a European affair or just a Balkan affair, and that there are no consequences, known or unintended, and whether or not we have the argument, well, further delay is not something that would work because we could have the potential for violence, which is true. That's a risk. But we also have to ask questions about why further delay might not have beneficial consequences as well. Is this an issue that we do want to provoke this kind of clash this year? Because I don't think that if you have a UDI, it will be clean, it will be definitive, and it will be decisive if it occurs in the next few weeks. So then you're ending up with this twilight situation where the European Union won't even itself be able to, as the Union, they may agree to authorize a mission, but will not agree on this question of whether or not they recognize it or not. And then questions of de facto partition, what happens to other arrangements in Bosnia and Macedonia. For those of you who have heard the Greek ambassador here, Alexandros Malias, who's been speaking on this issue, who is very much puzzled why we have this sense that it has to be resolved now, and we have to do it only in this way, when there are so many possible unintended consequences that could spin out. And why not keep a process going? It's what happened. People said that we were going to have violence in Cyprus when the Annan plan was not passed in 2004, that was the last chance. If we didn't get the plan, then the island would be convulsed by massive ethnic conflict between the two sides. That hasn't happened. The process continues. Politicians are continuing to meet. It's not ideal, and I think one of the things, and what I'd like to end with, is that there are no ideal situations to this. We have this mentality sometimes here in Washington that there's an optimal solution and less optimal. All the solutions that we can see on the table are going to be problematic, and I have to say, all of them are going to require a much greater degree of U.S. investment, including troops on the ground, than I think a number of our political leaders have decided that they're willing to countenance. So the idea that we can find the one solution, the UDI solution, the let's keep talks going and let's keep this process moving, that one is going to be so much better than the other, I think is problematic. And if you have all of these other issues on the table, then I do think it is wise to step back and to say, let's give this another look, and let's not let ourselves be driven by any sort of artificial timetable. We haven't done an artificial timetable for any of the other frozen conflicts that exist. And in this case, I think that U.S. policy on the frozen conflicts has generally been sound, and I would think that if it's working for us in other parts of the world, and in other parts of this region of the world, perhaps we should sit back and examine why we think this case is so different that it requires upending what is the traditional American practice, especially if it will complicate matters in Europe and potentially complicate matters with other key powers, powers that we're perhaps not as friendly with these days, like Russia, but even powers such as India and South Africa, fellow democracies that we do have a number of interests who have also indicated that they have some difficulties with how this process has been unfolding. So whether the province becomes independent or not is perhaps the discussion of another panel. My leaving thought in this is let's not rush into one decision one way or the other, and let's step back and take a fresh look.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. You mentioned Greek Ambassador Alexandros Malias. Let me make a shameless plug for my institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Ambassador Malias will be speaking next Wednesday morning at 10:30. If you have not gotten an invitation, if you're not on our, at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, Johns Hopkins SAIS, if you're not on our mailing list, nonetheless, you're still welcome. 10:30, Wednesday, February 6th, 1717 Mass Avenue, Northwest, 5th floor. I concur completely with Nicholas. Ambassador Malias is a really wonderful diplomat, tremendously experienced, and it will be an excellent program. Janusz Bugajski.
Okay. I used to know how to work our microphones, I forgot. Thanks very much, Mike. In particular, thanks for the historical overview. You missed several centuries, unfortunately, before the 14th. And let me just point out that for most of that time, between about the 8th and 13th century, Kosovo was actually part of two Bulgarian empires. I mean, Bulgaria has better claims to Kosovo actually than Serbia, if you was to look back at its history. Luckily, it doesn't have any such claims. So, you know, let me reassure you not to complicate things. I'm not going to focus on the pros and cons of independence. My position is pretty clear. For about 15 years, I think 17 years, Kosovo should have been independent. But that's, you know, that's a subject for another panel, or maybe a conversation between Dan and Nick. But what I'd like to do is to look at the bigger picture. In other words, to try and answer this question, is a new East-West, in other words, Russia, Europe, US, Russia on one side, Europe and US on the other, is it looming? Is this the beginning of a crisis? Or, as some would say, it's really a West-West crisis because of divisions within the European Union or divisions between European Union and the US. Let me say, I don't believe, and here I agree with Nick, I don't believe the declaration and acceptance, recognition of independence is going to provoke a crisis. But I think it does feed into the growing confrontation, as I see it, between Russia on the one hand and European Union and US and NATO on the other. I think Kosovo has become, I think, more than a wedge issue for Russia. It's now tactically and even strategically useful for Russia to use against what it perceives as negative Western interests which challenge its own national interests. I think without Russia's involvement during the past year, and I think our administration unfortunately didn't realize how Russia could play on this issue, could use this issue, could, let's say, form some sort of closer relationship with Serbia as a result of this. By the way, don't be fooled about this traditional friendship between Serbia and Russia. I think this is another misnomer. Russia has traditionally used Serbia and Bulgaria, sometimes both against each other, to project its own interests in the Balkans and Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean and Adriatic. Anyway, that aside, I think if it wasn't for Russian involvement, I think Kosovo would already be a Western supervised state. The administration here thought that Russia and China would both abstain in the UN Security Council rather than Russia actually blocking the decision on supervised independence. But it didn't calculate for the sort of renewed sense of vigor and the power projection, I think, that Russia is now displaying. So for Russia, I think it's a win-win situation. Ideally, they'd like to see Kosovo as another frozen conflict. Why? Because then the territory is prevented from stabilization. It prevents either Serbia, Kosovo, and even some of its neighbors from moving more quickly towards NATO.